All right, welcome everybody back to another episode of the Big Doug and Carmi Show. George is out, but in for today is Lindsay Rhodes.
Hi.
Today, hello. One half of the Bleav Fantasy Football Show. It's interesting when we had Brett Coleman on a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about the way the industry is moving. And I'm curious when you have where do you think it's heading? I mean, you don't have to be part of a huge network anymore. That once
Right.
was like the dream and the goal. And I'm not saying that it shouldn't still be, but there's so many ways that people consume information.
For
It's
sure.
fascinating. Where do you think all of this is heading?
Gosh. If I had that answer. It seems pretty obvious that I think that there's pros and cons to the direction that it's going. Certainly a pro. Well, I think most people would see it as a pro is that it's more democratized. There isn't necessarily a gatekeeper standing in the way. Like if you can reach an audience and if you're good at uh opining about football in this case, or if you come up with a niche and you can carve out a direction that you want to go in that adds value as a content creator, then you can build an audience and there's nobody standing in the door that goes, I don't know if you're the right look, or I don't know if you're the right whatever. So if you can do the job, then it's kind of on you to prove that you can do the job, and here's your platform, go get it. The downside for people who have chosen broadcasting as a career is that is definitely carving into the industry, and you're seeing that everywhere, right? Like, I mean, you see layoffs galore, and I think it's because it's harder to monetize at the rate that you need to as a big company to pay people the living wages that you would like them to be earning, because just the audience is so carved into and spread out. Everybody listens to like different podcasts or watches different YouTube shows, and there's so many different ways to kind of scratch that itch of content consumption that I think it makes it so that there's a lot more people who can maybe monetize this, but maybe fewer people who can actually make a lot of money doing this, if that makes sense.
Sure. It's interesting. I started doing the fantasy football podcast segment a couple of years ago, and the fantasy football community,
Oof.
there's a fantasy football world, it
Yeah.
feels like.
Yeah, there
And there's
is.
a fantasy football community. Like I was at my old college roommate's his son is graduating, and we were over there talking ball. I was talking about fantasy football, best ball drafts. And the guys that only do one home league are looking at me like
Yeah.
I'm insane. Like, what are you talking about? How are you doing drafts right now? The two are really kind of separate, but when you get into like the fantasy football community that kind of does it year round, I think it's more unique and diverse than maybe any of the rest of them. How do you find the community? It feels like it tries to be more connective maybe than some of the rest of them.
There goes my light. Hold, please. As,
Yes.
as she ducks out of frame. Um, anyway, it's a professional operation here. Um, I think that the one of the things that I found about the fantasy community is that everybody is really welcoming, and I think that that stems from the fantasy community having been shit on for so many years.
Right. Right.
Like when I first started at NFL Network, there was definitely a vibe of like, no, I do real football, not fantasy. And I think that those worlds have definitely like meshed a lot more in recent years. And I think a lot of the people that are traditional football analysts now, more of them, see the value in the analysis coming out of the fantasy space. And I think also that with the proliferation of podcasts and Substacks and all this different stuff, the data science that's really become prevalent in the last few years, there's so much more information that's available for people to scour and try and find edges and trends and things like that that are actually smart. And it's not just, I think this person's going to score 16 points a game this year. I think they're going to score 14. Like that sounds like a dumb conversation to a lot of people who are just traditional football fans. And I think that they think that that's what fantasy is. I think there's a huge chunk of the fantasy community that I think my stance is that fantasy analysis, for the most part, is football analysis. You're doing football analysis. And then at the very end of your analysis, you're just pointing it towards the fantasy space. And sometimes the analysis is like a niche thing, like in Scott Fishbowl, you're going over, oh, the scoring's different this year and tight ends are premium. And so where should we draft them? But even that conversation is which of the tight ends do you think is going to have the most value this year? And that requires you to be able to have just a basic football analysis conversation. And one of the reasons I got into fantasy originally when I was working at NFL Network was to just really have a full grasp of the league. Like in TV, like it or not, it tends to be a lot of the same teams that are talked about because TV's ratings driven, right? Like they need the numbers to stay high. So the way that they keep the numbers high is to talk about the things that generate the most viewers. And a lot of times that's specific teams. You are definitely hearing people talk about Dallas more often than not for a reason, right? Like and quarterbacks, like kind of the low-hanging fruit that appeals to the broadest group of people. So part of the reason I got into fantasy was because I really felt like I needed to understand the league on a much deeper level than the things that I was talking about on a daily basis. And fantasy really prepares you to understand who the number 3 receiver is in everyone who plays fantasy to the entire receiving core is.
Yeah.
And what the backfield depth looks like and who the tight ends are and whether they use the tight ends or you understand, you have to understand the patterns that are there, offensive coordinator patterns, head coaching patterns, all that kind of stuff if you want to have any success in fantasy football. Or you could just have your mother-in-law pick teams based on like whether or not they look friendly and then they win your fantasy league that's a home league, and that's a different conversation.
They always win the home league that way.
My mother-in-law, who knows zero about football, zero. I started a dynasty league last year for just family and friends, right? And so it's all like my family, my brother's family, some of them, his mom. I mean, not my brother's, my husband's. His mom knows nothing about football. And she was smoking fools for the first half of the season. And partially though, and I think that this is a good thing about fantasy, is that there's so much information that's available. If you're not even paying attention, there's rankings right in front of you that tell you who the best person is to pick up off of waivers. And so you don't even have to do the research yourself. You can just go, this is telling me to pick up Zach Moss. I will do that. And then that kind of sucks for those of us that are like coming up with the answers ourselves. But it's also inclusive, right? So, and I think that that's a good thing too. Bring as many fans to the table so that it's as broad a conversation as it can possibly be. That's certainly good for the league, but I think that's fun for all of us too.
No doubt. There are more ways to play now than ever before. Do you have a favorite way of playing?
I like all of them. I think just regular, it sounds boring, but like regular redraft managed teams. Like right now, you talked about best ball. This is a big best ball part of the season. Yeah. People are just, best ball draft after best ball draft. And I love doing those and I love doing them now. But once the season starts, I find that me personally, I don't check those as much. Like it's just, am I winning? And every couple of weeks I'll look and see where I stack up in those contests that I entered. But because it doesn't require my management, because I am in more redraft leagues than I can probably comfortably manage with, so I find that's where I focus. And so during the season, that's actually what I end up enjoying the most. Within that, I like Superflex because I think it makes it a little bit harder. It changes the structure of your draft, and it makes it so that, if you're going and grabbing the quarterbacks earlier, then it makes it a little bit more strategic about when you're going to pick up those other pieces that are going to go into your flex. I like deep flex spots. I like bigger rosters of players that you have to play that kind of force you to know what you're talking about. And I like deep benches. My pet peeve in fantasy football is shallow benches. And I play in one league in particular that has like a 5-person bench and like one flex spot. And there's always great players on the waiver wire. And I feel like that actually benefits the people who are just really casually paying attention, because you can't stash the ones. You can't draft someone that is going to blow up, but you just want to put them on your bench right now, but you think that they're a good you're not rewarded for getting out in front of it, I guess. And so that drives me insane as somebody who is who is doing that work and very much wants to be rewarded for it.
On the degen scale, we've had folks on that will hit all of the markers that you can on best ball. How many best balls will you do before we get to the regular season?
I have only done one so far. I have not been. No, I know. I have not jumped into that yet for time consumption standpoint. So I will do that, but I'm definitely not somebody who does like 300. There are people like
Harris was on the other day. I think he's already done 100.
Yeah, no, I won't do that personally. Primarily, honestly, the reason I'm doing best ball is more to understand the flow of the draft. Right. Not really so that I can monetize best ball. And I know a lot of people are obviously playing for that reason. And the more rosters that you have, the greater your chances are of, winning big. Same with DFS. I just play differently in that regard. For me, it's less of a money generator as much as it is. I like to play the format so that I understand the format and so that I understand how other people are viewing the format. I like it to inform all of my content. So I think because I'm not looking at it as a monetary thing, I'm not trying to win a lot of money doing best ball, then I am not looking at it as mathematically as a lot of people. I'm looking at it analytically and saying who do I want? What is the best roster that I think I could put together in this particular draft for this particular scoring system? And I think a lot of people who are doing hundreds of best balls are looking at different variations and just playing with the different combinations. And it's a different type of strategy that is not the one that I have the bandwidth to take at this point in my life.
Have you gotten into IDP yet?
I've never done IDP.
Really?
I know. That's also a bandwidth thing. But everybody tells me that I have to do IDP and that I'll never go back and it'll be my favorite thing that I've ever done.
Particularly if you're into the big rosters.
Yes. And the nerdiness, right? That's you gotta be nerdy. The problem that I have, and tell me if I'm wrong, the problem that I have just conceptually when people are trying to pitch me on it is that, and I guess you could say this about traditional fantasy football too, I don't know that it necessarily rewards the best defensive players. It's rewarding specific defensive players because the scoring could be for somebody who has the most tackles, let's say. So tackles could get you fantasy football points. Well, we all know that the leading tackler on a team isn't their best defensive player, right? That, I mean, oftentimes that's a sign of a bad defense or a bad, it could be that you have a bad, and I understand that there's strategy in figuring out what that is regardless. But I don't necessarily if you have the best cornerback in the league and people aren't throwing at them, and so therefore they don't have any value in fantasy. To me, that doesn't check the box of why I'm there. What it is that I enjoy about fantasy, which is kind of trying to figure out who's good, who's not good, who's getting it done, why that's the case. And so if it's kind of just a scoring tweak that makes somebody very valuable in fantasy, that doesn't actually mean that they're good, I tend to enjoy that format a little bit less because I don't feel like I get anything out of it, in terms of just talking about regular football. If I'm not talking about fantasy football, I want my fantasy stuff to inform my analysis that's just traditional NFL analysis. And I'm not sure that's particularly helpful.
That being said, I do think if you play it, you'll enjoy it.
I know. Everyone says
more
that.
Points, the better, right? More points. You mentioned Scott Fish. I'm glad I said Scott Fish because I normally call him Scott Fishbowl, and I know that's not right. I don't know if you have no problem with that.
I bet he hears that all the time.
He's got to, right? I find myself doing that all the time.
Also, if you're him, that's flattering. You've branded you are a brand. That's incredible.
Right. It's impressive to say the least. The new format will be extremely tight end friendly. I know that you had him on the show the other day. Are there any pieces of wisdom you can pass to those of us in the Scott Fishbowl?
So if you missed that conversation, and by the way, you can go back and listen to it on the Bleav Fantasy Football Show, available wherever you get your podcast. Scott was on, And it's very tight end premium this year. You could, as he laid out a scenario, it's like, I mean, you could get like 3 points. It's like a 1.5. Everything else is like 1 point PPR. Tight end is like 1.5 for everything. So it's he laid out a scenario where if a tight end catches a 10-yard pass, then you get a 1.5 for the 10 yards, and you get a 1.5 for the reception. So that's is that right?
That's 3 points. There's 3
He said it was
points on
a 4-point play. Anyway, it's a lot of points, is my point, for like a small thing that the tight end does. So tight ends are going to go a lot earlier in Scott Fishbowl than they are in your typical redraft leagues. And that's a separate conversation, because I kind of think that Sam Laporte is getting pushed up the board a little bit more high than I would like to take in a regular redraft. But there's a lot of value with those top guys. There were, I think he said, 4 tight ends. If we implemented this year's scoring system to last year's stats, there would have been 4 tight ends in the top 18 of scorers in Scott Fishbowl, which is crazy. And also notable, there were only 5 quarterbacks in the top 18. So quarterbacks almost always dominate fantasy football scoring. And the conversation about whether or not you can wait on quarterbacks just has to do with the degree of drop off from one quarterback to the next, and the fact that they all score more points, right? So there's less value in getting a guy early necessarily, because the guy who you might be able to get 10 rounds later might only score 4 points less per game, let's say, just as an example. So, but they all score more points than everybody else. In this format, he nerfed the quarterbacks, which isn't, I feel like it's a new term that I'm now getting used to hearing.
Explain it, please, because I saw it the other day.
So it's like they soften the scoring. And we actually talked to Scott. We were like, where did this phrase come by? And he didn't know the answer. So if anybody does, let us know.
Please.
But we think it's like you soften the scoring system or something, like a nerf. Anyway, so the scoring system, he just devalued them across the board, so that quarterbacks, it's still super flex, but the second quarterback, which in a traditional super flex, you would always play a quarterback in the second super flex spot, even if they're crappy, because a crappy quarterback is going to score more points usually than a wide receiver or running back that you might have available to put in that spot. So you're almost always going to start a quarterback in that super flex spot. But in this system where the quarterback scoring is devalued, he did that on purpose so that you would actually have to think about it and say, is this quarterback going to score more points than this wide receiver or this running back? There's another twist that he put in it, and it has to do with rosters. And you might not have wanted this much information about Scott Fishbowl, but here you have it. That the scoring is always important in every fantasy league, but in Scott Fishbowl this year, I think the roster settings are as important as the scoring. And that's because you only have to start 1 running back, and you only have to start 1 wide receiver. And then you've got 6 flex spots, start 1 tight end and 1 quarterback, but then you've got these super flex spot and then the 6 flex spots. So if you only have to start 1 running back, then in my opinion, Christian McCaffrey's value just went through the roof, right? Because now you're like, if I can just check that box and I've got Christian McCaffrey and I'm plugging him in and that might be the only running back I have to ever play. I mean, realistically not, but you know what I mean? That's the only one. Just set it and forget it. There's so much value there. So
does that make the value for the number 1 overall pick in Scott Fishbowl more important?
I think so. And I picked, because for people who do Scott Fishbowl, if you're in a live draft, you have to pick your slot before you even find out the scoring system. And I picked the 6th spot because Scott Fishbowl is usually super flex in some way, shape, or form. And it is again this year. I just didn't count on the nerfing. So I picked the 6th spot so that I could be guaranteed. I did the math and thought, okay, there's 6 quarterbacks, let's say, that I feel comfortable taking. So I'm going to take the latest spot that I feel comfortable that I'm going to get a very good QB1. Then I'm still early enough to get a good QB2 and or a really good position player in that spot. And then also in the 6th spot, I like the fact that you're never that far away. If a run breaks out, you're never that far away. And so you don't miss out on something completely. But now I'm thinking, I don't like my spot. I would much rather be up at the front of the draft, which is not a spot that I traditionally actually even like. I prefer in like your regular redraft. I kind of like being around, usually around the like 10 or, like something on the back end so that I can get that turn pretty quickly. And I've got 2 players that I feel comfortable with. In this case, I don't really know what I'm going to do because 6.
I feel like the majority of the folk we've had on this year for fantasy football have been torn between always when I asked the quick, I was going to ask you, where do you like drafting? And I get people that say, I want the best player every time. That's about half of them. And then the other half usually are right there around. I like 6, 8 so that I can get back in there and still feel good about that second round.
When they say I want the best player every time, are they talking like I want 1.1?
Yes.
Oh, I never want that. Yeah. Never.
And
first of all,
try to convince me it's because there'll still be enough talent left there at the next turn so that the second and third there you get to go back to back.
I don't know. Well, there is value there, unless it's third round reversal, in which case
I don't think I play that in any of my leagues.
No. So yeah, at the end of the second round, let's see, I'm looking at some NFFC ADP data, and NFFC is way different than redraft because this is primarily high stakes leagues, and high stakes drafters tend to draft a little bit differently than, like your friends will. But at the end of the second round, you're looking at Nico Collins is the last pick of the second round. Okay. They're taking Josh Allen and Sam Laporta at the end of the second round before them, which I wouldn't do. And then Josh Jacobs, Isaiah Pacheco. I just kind of think that I would prefer to start my build. And I love Nico, but this year Nico is in a 3 wide receiver offense. And so we have to figure out some unknowns there, right? Like you throw Steph Diggs in that offense and you figure Nico's targets have to get cut into. And then how many does Tank Dell have? And so I think they'll all be very good, but they might be capped just in terms of, their target share there. So, whereas on the other side, you could get, you could make an argument like Marvin Harrison is a guy that you could get kind of close to the turn. You're going to be looking at like a Garrett Wilson, a Chris Olave, Devontae Adams. And so, I guess there's an argument that Nico Collins, you could make the argument that Nico's as good as that, but I feel like there's usually every year's different. Usually there's a drop at that point where I feel less confident about the wide receivers that I'm getting and running backs at that point, like the end of the second round. So I think I'd rather just get those like really high end guys and then be done with that for my first couple of picks.
Who gives you more pause, Aaron Rodgers or Kirk Cousins?
Oh, Aaron. Yeah. Aaron. 100%. Kirk, I think, he's coming off the injury. They both are.
That's why I brought him up.
Yeah, no, yeah. I think Kirk, I feel like I understand who Kirk is as a fantasy quarterback. And
Kyle Pitts is going to like Kirk Cousins as a fantasy quarterback.
God, I hope so. I hope so. I think we all want Kyle Pitts to like Kirk Cousins as a fantasy quarterback. And clearly the catchable targets that he's going to see are going to go way up, right? So yes. But it's just, there's Kyle Pitts every single year we say it, right? And I know that this year we're saying it for a different reason because he actually has a quarterback that's proven to be competent. And so that's kind of a big thing. But the whole Kyle Pitts, like, this is his year, scares me. It scares me. Would you rather have, Fabs and I had this conversation actually on our podcast the other day. Would you rather have Evan Ingram or Kyle Pitts? Because they're kind of going to go in roughly the same range.
Yeah, and they're similar too, right? Because Evan Ingram was the Kyle Pitts before he broke out last year, it feels like. Yeah. I'll just say this about Kyle Pitts. The quarterback has been very good to tight ends throughout his career, all the way back with us and Vernon Davis and Jordan Reed. Then he gets to Minnesota and they're pummeling him targets when they traded for Hawkinson. So it feels like if ever there was a time to buy Kyle Pitts stock, it's now, because there aren't many quarterbacks that appreciate the tight end. I feel like the way Kirk has historically.
Kirk is, at the very least, Kirk is a professional quarterback,
That's
right?
right.
Like, he's not going to be in the mix to be QB1 in fantasy or in real NFL. Like, that's not his conversation, but his floor is high. He is not going to fail you. He is going to be efficient. He's going to get the ball to your assets. He's going to raise the floor for everybody. And so there's some comfortability in that.
And you got to get him super cheap.
Yeah, well, yes, 100%. Yeah, Aaron Rodgers scares me a little bit more because we've seen some volatility with him over the years. Sometimes he's really good in fantasy. Sometimes he's good in real life, but it doesn't translate to fantasy. Sometimes lately, more recently, we haven't seen him be that good. You know what I mean? Like the last year in Green Bay, it was like, it's not all the pieces around you. Like, yeah, I don't know what to make of this. Like, he didn't look like the MVP. He himself, if you just take his play and lifted it out, it wasn't the same. And so we haven't seen him with the Jets. We haven't seen him since then. You know, so we don't know if there's going to be a drop off in talent. I mean, you would think not. He's Aaron Rodgers, but I don't know. And so that, for that reason, especially with the injury coupled in there, Garrett Wilson kind of scares me too.
Yeah, me too.
Because Garrett's floor last year, in an admittedly awful situation. Like, we all love Garrett Wilson. The talent is insane. But his floor's like, hey, we're looking at 12 points. You know what I mean? Like, that's not getting it done. And so if you go, okay, worst case scenario, Aaron gets hurt again and he's not there. Are we looking at 12 again? Like, Justin Jefferson last year with bad quarterback play, with the bad quarterbacks that he played with, he averaged 18. I think it's 18.6 a game off the top of my head. And you're talking about like Nick Mullins and whatever. So his floor in a bad situation is much higher, right? Like, so I feel like I'm much more confident about like Justin Jefferson, where he's going in the middle of the first round. I feel like you're getting value there because you're getting him at his floor, right? Like, what if the quarterback plays there good? Right. If it's good this year, then he very much could be wide receiver 1. And if it's not good, well, his average last year with Nick Mullins and those backup quarterbacks that he played with when Kirk Cousins wasn't in the game was good enough for wide receiver 5. So you're getting him at his floor. Like, I want that.
Yeah. Yes, you do. All right, we read these shows with a would you rather. So I went to footballguys.com, looked up ADP for these. So it's like this. So Jamar Chase at 4 or T Higgins at 50.
Ooh, that's a good one. I thought you were going to go like in the same range, and I was ready to go, and then you threw T Higgins out, and I was like, shoot, I don't know. Gosh, that one's hard just because of build, but I would probably say Chase.
Puka at 9 or Cup at 36.
Damn it. God, these are hard. These are very hard. I love Puka. I'm going to go Puka.
Tyreek at 3 or Waddle at 35.
Tyreek. I would potentially take Tyreek over CD. I would take Tyreek as high as 2, assuming I don't get the 1.1, because I don't want CMC at 1.1. That's the pick I don't want this year. I just don't want it. So, but Tyreek is one of the players I have the most confidence in. I know exactly what he's going to do unless he gets hurt, and who we can't plan for that. But I know exactly who he is. I'm in that offense. I know what they are. I'm confident in him.
AJ Brown at 10 or Devontae at 39.
I feel like there's a pattern emerging, and it's me taking the higher guy across the board. And that's, I think, why I say like the build kind of matters, but you're also mentioning people that I'm not excited to take in those ranges. Like, I'm not like scrambling to get T and I'm like, yes, I got T here. Okay. In those ranges, I think I'm probably more pivoting to running backs. And so I think that's why my brain is pushing them out of the way. The Devontae and T are both very good wide receiver 2s in their offense. And so that's why they're going kind of in the range that they are. But that's a wide receiver 2 range. I think I would go AJ. I auto drafted AJ in the best ball draft that I told you I was doing. I have 7 hours on the clock, and for some reason missed the notification, missed it, auto drafted, started my build. Probably wouldn't have drafted AJ Brown, to be honest with you, but that's where my build started.
I don't have the ADPs for them. They're pretty close. It's kind of a separate conversation, but I'm curious your thoughts on the Washington backfield with Brian Robinson Jr. and then the addition of Eckler.
Well, here's the thing I'm
they're
most
like 5 or
curious about.
6 apart. Like they're really close in ADP.
I hate saying this. I love Eckler. What we saw last year concerned me. And I know that he's in a totally different situation this year where he's not the only guy in the backfield. So you can put him in a position to succeed. He has had a lot more success in the passing game throughout the course of his career. I mean, 2 years ago, there was no run game in Los Angeles, the Chargers, right? Like it was a passing game, which is clearly a problem. But I was worried a little bit about what I saw last year. And I think there's more paths to success for Brian Robinson in Washington. I do think that there is an interesting question that we'll maybe find out more about once training camps hit. And that's that Kingsbury seems to be experimenting in the spring with 2 back sets. So is he going to do that? He didn't do that much in Arizona. So is that something he's actually going to see in the fall? Or is he doing that because, they've sort of described the spring there as a passing season, right? So is that because that's what they're sort of doing and testing out, and that's not something that we're going to see? Because if we see them both on the field at the same time, then I think that is much more interesting for Eckler, to be honest with you. If not, and we go back to a more traditional, early down versus third down type of situation, then I think Brian Robinson is the one that I would go with.
The Washington offense is still one of the most intriguing, not just because I'm a fan and that's what we do on the podcast, but the offense itself, I think, is really intriguing because we have no idea what it's going to be. Cliff's been out of the game for a little bit, has had plenty of time to look at what's going on. They want to go hurry up, but the league is using motion. Nothing's worse for hurry up than motion. So I'm curious how they'll kind of sort that. They've got Anthony Lynn there, who does a much better job with the play action. And they've got Brian Johnson, who a couple of years ago with the Eagles, that offense was humming before he was given the offensive coordinator job. So like what it looks like with Jaden Daniels and McLaurin with a guy that maybe can get him the ball down the field.
Right.
Interesting. I haven't seen amount of just Daniels stock. What do you think he's going to look like this year for fantasy?
Do you, I think that he has a lot of upside, right? In the same vein, in very different quarterbacks. So I actually almost don't like this comparison, but like you saw some Anthony Richardson in the handful of games that he was playing. You saw what his ability to take off with the ball, like what that rushing capability does to just your fantasy football stats. Like he's in the top 5 conversation immediately just because of the variety that he brings to the table. I think the question with Jaden Daniels, because he's clearly a dynamic runner, is how he approaches running, because he's also established in college that he's not the type of guy who's just constantly looking to tuck it and run, right? Like he's a disciplined, stay in the pocket, in structure type of quarterback who then also can take off and run. And that adds us fantasy value. But there's always a question with a young quarterback. I think the question with him, and you brought up some interesting, like bigger picture offensive questions, and I have a few more to add too, but it's just with the rookie quarterback, it's how quickly they get up to speed with the pre-snap reads, right? Like if he can diagnose the defense quickly at the beginning of the season, then I think the ability to stay in the pocket and just run the offense the way that they want it to be run, obviously the chances of that happening go up. If he feels like, I don't know what I'm seeing, and clearly defenses are better at disguising than they are in college and what he's seen in college. And if he feels like, shit, I don't know what's going on, will he tuck it and run? Even though that's not in his history, because he knows he can, and he just doesn't know where to go with the ball. So I'm always curious about that with a dual threat quarterback in particular when they're a rookie. I mean, that's always a huge question for any rookie quarterback when they have the ability to tuck and run, as opposed to just stand there and take the sack like Sam did. Then there's that added layer of like, I don't know how much running there will be, So I think he's certainly an interesting fantasy option because the upside is massive Like he has the potential to put up huge numbers. You just aren't really sure. And at the very least, I think the rushing component, assuming we see it to a degree, even if it's not like what everyone thinks when they think rushing quarterback, even if we see a little bit of it, that'll raise his floor if he's struggling within the offense. So it makes him a safer rookie quarterback to pick.
Lindsay, this has been great. What tell the folks at home when they can find the Bleav Fantasy Football Show?
A new episode's out every Tuesday and Thursday. And then when the season, once we hit like training camps and that's fantasy season for sure. Once you start kind of pivoting to like, who do I want to draft this year? Then we'll be putting out episodes a lot more frequently. So check us out, hit that subscribe button when it's fantasy season for you. If it's not fantasy season for you already, then those episodes will be there ready to consume. And in the meantime, we'll be hitting some bigger picture fantasy issues every Tuesday and Thursday.
Thank you. This was great.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.